Harry, we come now to chapters 12 to 14, which continues in some ways what Paul's been talking about, which is the gathered life of the community. In the discussion of the very beginning of 1 Corinthians, you pointed out that one of the things Paul thanks God for is the spiritual gifts of the Corinthian community, and now we have 3 chapters where he's talking about what spiritual gifts are and how that affects their communal life. What's going on here?
Well, it goes back a little bit to the remark that we made in the last chapter, talking about being in a worship setting where there's a sense that you're participating in the heavenly worship, worship by angels.
Yeah.
And I think some people in the Corinthian congregation tried to manifest that, or thought they were manifesting it, by speaking in a language that was unintelligible to the folk in the community. And exactly how they got into this state and what they were doing and what the language sounded like, we have no idea. But they were speaking in an unintelligible tongue as a sign of their spiritual endowment. Yeah. And I think Paul finally objects to this and says, on the one side, I can understand it. Here, again, as always, he speaks to both sides of the debate. And he says, I can understand this phenomenon. I do it myself.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it's not to be preferred. All things might be possible, but not all things are beneficial.
Don't have to do everything that's possible.
That's right. Yeah. And what we have to take into account here, he says, we have to discern the body, to use the language of chapter 11 again. And the body is the assembled group of believers. Yeah. And whatever we do in that worship assembly has to build them up. Yeah. And it also has to look beyond the boundaries of that worship assembly. And it has to make sense in some way to people outside of it.
Wander in.
So just doing things for our own self-satisfaction, to build up ourselves, to puff up ourselves, to use language that he deploys earlier on in the letter, that won't cut it for the Christian worship assembly. Yeah. So that's the basic issue here. And as in chapters 8 through 10, where he was dealing with the issue of eating meat sacrificed to idols, here he gives us an excursus in chapter 13.
It's kind of like a sandwich you have.
That's right.
Speaking in tongues, chapter 13.
And the sandwich is structured in the same way, affirming on the one side and then calling into question on the other. Yeah. But in the center, there's this this framing of a fundamental value, a virtue. And in this case, it's love. Yeah. And we have this marvelously poetic chapter on love. Yeah. It's not about weddings.
No, it's not. Though I've used it often in that context.
That's right. Yes. It always comes up in weddings. And it's entirely
you can make it work.
Useful in weddings, but that's not what Paul was talking about.
Exactly.
Paul was talking about living in community. Yeah. And that love of the neighbor and community has to ground everything else that we do, including what we decide to do for worship. So before getting to that, though, in chapter 12, he deploys...
Let me just do one quick thing on that, and it's the wedding thing, exactly it. For years I did this, though I speak in the tongues of people and of angels, and thought, what a lovely rhetorical kind of Shakespearean flourish. But that's the point. But the point is, even though I have angel language, which is the speaking in tongues stuff, but don't have love, that's not it. So it very much is the topic sentence, not a rhetorical flourish to get going.
Exactly. Okay. Very much so. Yeah. Chapter 13, verse 1. Yeah, it ties it in very nicely. But the argument that he deploys in chapter 12 is interesting, too. Remember, in chapter 11, he had been talking about the body.
Discerning the body.
And discerning the body, and there was an element of the communal there. People had to wait for one another and take one another into account, as well as an element of the symbolic, the Eucharistic body. Well, here he uses body language again. And what we pointed out earlier on when he was talking about how women should behave in leading worship, he deploys an argument and then corrects it. We see something similar going on here, because he deploys the body image in chapter 12, verse 12 and following, in such a way as to recall the kind of rhetoric that you get in Greco-Roman political contexts. There's a famous chapter in the Roman historian Livy about a revolt by plebeians in Rome that was countered by a senatorial patrician who said to the plebeians, we are all part of one body. And this is a fellow named Menenius Agrippa. And he said, well, even though we senators look like the belly and you guys look like the feet and the arms, we have to hang in there together. You feed us, but we nourish you. All right, so there's that use of it, which is a kind of hierarchical.
Yeah, easy use for the belly to say, right? Yeah.
Now, Paul, in deploying this image, talks about the mutuality of all of he emphasizes mutuality and not hierarchy.
Very much so.
Which is quite interesting. So all the body parts have to hang together, and that's very much what he was saying in the previous chapter about discerning the body. But he also wants to correct that, and here, in a hierarchical way, in chapter 12, verses 27 and following. Why? Because his concern is with the way in which this spiritual gift of speaking in tongues is to be evaluated.
Yeah.
And so he says there are different gifts and graces in the church, different charisms, and at the top of the list stands apostles, and then prophets and teachers.
And what's the bottom, Harry?
People who do deeds of power and healing, and forms of assistance and forms of leadership. That's where I stand as a dean, right? And then various kinds of tongues. So tongues are really down there at the bottom.
And various kinds of tongues.
Right. So Paul wants to make sure that people understand that this particular spiritual gift is not the most...
A genuine gift, but very much qualified by the others. Just one thing that strikes me about that is that absolutely this is metaphor, absolutely this is image. It's also that body, spirit, magical thing we've talked about, that when Paul talks about church as body of Christ, two other places that comes up in the epistle that have always struck me are, one, we didn't talk about this, warning men not to go to prostitutes, because when they do that, when a Christian male who's part of the body of Christ has intercourse with a prostitute, Christ has intercourse with a prostitute, and that's blasphemy. And that when a believer has intercourse with an unbeliever, the unbeliever is sanctified by that, because body of Christ is making love to non-believing person. It's just, I mean, it is a metaphor, it is an image, but it's also somehow thickly realistic too. It's an embodied spirituality in ways I can't very seriously, in ways I don't altogether comprehend, but it's strong, I think.
Okay, so one of the things that Paul is insisting on here is that there has to be orderly worship.
Yeah.
And that there's a hierarchy in the way that this operates. So preaching is going to be more important
than tongue speaking.
Than this tongue speaking stuff. And the preaching has to be intelligible both to those inside and out. So that's all good. And then all of a sudden, bingo, in chapter 14, verse 33 and following, we have Paul saying that women should be silent in church. Now, doesn't this contradict what we heard back in chapter 11? That
where women are talking away, where the only issue is what women should wear on their heads. This is one of the few places where I've been persuaded by the argument we love to use, which is that the bad Paul is not the real Paul. I mean, it goes back to my kind of interpretive claim that when in doubt, check the good Paul and use it to qualify the less good Paul. This is not just good Paul, bad Paul. This doesn't sound like Paul at all. This sounds like it's wandered in from somewhere else. What do you think?
I think that's right. And it's interesting that these several verses appear in several different places in the manuscripts. So there's a little instability there, and you begin to wonder. And then you also have to see why it's placed there, because in the next verse, verse 37, anyone who claims to be a prophet or to have spiritual powers must acknowledge that what I am writing to you is a command of the Lord. So, in effect, by having that little bit there, which stands out like a sore thumb in this context, which is all about orderliness and worship, is there because it's being grounded in a command of the Lord, not simply in Paul's own opinion. So I think what's happened is that some later scribe in the Pauline tradition, who has, like many people in the church, adapted to Greco-Roman norms and wants to keep women in their place, takes this passage wherever he got it and sticks it
Wonderful opportunity to put that in there,
as a way of grounding it in the
I think that's right.
teaching of Jesus.
I think that's right.
So what Paul's really interested in is clear from verse 38 and following, right? Be eager to prophesy and do not forbid speaking in tongues.
That's a great line. I mean, all right if you must speak in tongues, but prophesy absolutely.
And then what Presbyterians love, but all things should be done decently and in order.
Exactly. It's the story of a whole Presbyterian life. Each thing decently and in order.